Test, test. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Advancing Nationally Determined Contributions, Signs of Progress. We know how busy everyone is. It is the Tuesday of the second week of these negotiations, and we want to take a moment to be able to celebrate some of the good work that is going on around the world. And for many of you who work with us over at the United Nations Development Program in close partnership with UNFCCC and ILO for this event, you know we're not going to have sort of a normal event. We're going to have some art. We're going to have some poetry. We are going to have some inspiring stories during this event. And so to start us off, we are going to have a poem by a special guest, Ahmed Bard. And he is an Iraqi-American multimedia artist and poet. He's the author of While the Earth Sleeps, We Travel, Stories, Poetry, and Art from Young Refugees Around the World. Ahmed, over to you.
Hi everyone, hope you can hear me okay. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor and a privilege. As mentioned, my name is Ahmed Badr, and I'm a poet and a storyteller, and I run an organization called Narratio, which runs a storytelling fellowship for refugee youth with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm also really passionate about climate storytelling and have produced several works commissioned by the World Bank and the Connect for Climate program. And today I'll be reading one of those poems called Representation Poem that seems to, or that hopes to address these common questions that we often try to ask at big events like COP around youth representation and what it represents and what it means. And so this is Representation Poem. What do you hear and who do you hear? What do you see and who do you see? Look around and recognize the stakes of your presence. Look around and recognize the stakes of your absence. This is not another representation poem. This is not another gesture. This is not another invitation. This is a demand. This is acknowledgement. This is accountability. This is a reminder. This is invisible made visible, or this is invisible addressing invincible, or this is resistance to visibility as the only answer. Who do you hear and what do you hear? What do you see and who do you see? What do you see and who do you see? Out of many we rise to proclaim. One of many we rise to proclaim. We are not a single story. We can never be a single story. This is not victim. This is not victim. This is not powerless speaking to powerful. This is not angry young person. This is not angry young people. This is not angry young generation. This is consequences speaking. Past, present, and future. What do you hear and who do you hear? What do you see and who do you see? This is not another representation poem. This is not another gesture. This is not another invitation. This is who we are and where we stand. And we know where we must go from here. This is not powerless speaking to powerful. This is not angry young person. This is not angry young people. This is not angry young generation. This is consequences speaking. How will you respond? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Who we are and where do we stand? I think these words cannot be more powerful given where we are at this conference. And to start us off, we are going to hear from the United Nations Development Program Administrator, Achim Steiner. The climate promise and much of the vision for the climate promise has come from him. He's been a long-time advocate for ambitious climate action and has encouraged UNDP to do everything we can to support countries with their nationally determined contributions. And so I'm very pleased to introduce Achim Steiner, who is here via video.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, regrettably, I'm unable to join you in person today, as was my hope. Climate change is often a story driven by headlines of hopelessness and news feeds of defeatism. As a global community, we are far from our target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yet, the averages contained in many reports often obscure the seismic shifts that are taking place at the local, national, and at times also at international levels. This is not to minimize the time lag and the challenges we now face, but it is also to keep a perspective on those who actually act and what they're accomplishing should equally inform what happens next. This event focuses on these signals of hope from countries and communities that are forging ahead with decisive climate action. Through our Climate Promise Initiative, the United Nations Development Program is supporting 120 countries to support their nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and we do so in partnership with many other organizations. While developing countries bear the disproportionate consequence of climate change today, we are seeing how they are also leading the world on ambition. They are taking even more control over their development trajectories with these pledges. As a result, 90% of countries have increased their mitigation ambition, and 95% of them have increased their adaptation ambition. Many of them are rapidly transitioning to the green energy infrastructure of tomorrow, but also of today. Crucially, the evidence demonstrates that these NDCs are starting to significantly bend the emissions curve downwards. As our window to limit the worst effects of climate change closes, now is the time to implement these NDCs, the overarching aim of the Climate Promise's new phase. That means scaling up our support to turn these NDC targets into concrete action, helping countries to deploy new solutions that will drive forward all 17 Sustainable Development Goals while addressing the challenge of climate change. That involves leveraging NDCs as sovereign investment plans. For instance, look to Zimbabwe, where assessments found that for every $1 million invested in conservation agriculture, 30,000 green jobs could be created. By ensuring that countries can access technologies, finance, and expertise, we are seeing how countries are taking bold climate action. To take just one example, consider the Africa Mini-Grids program launching at COP27. Solar mini-grids can bring electricity to 265 million people in 21 countries across the continent of Africa by the year 2030, helping to drive major progress on countries' NDC energy targets. Countries are also strengthening their adaptation and resilience. For example, Samoa is restoring ecosystems and building flood management solutions. As a result, 1/3 of the population is now protected from flood risks. Or consider countries such as Colombia, Ecuador, and Kenya. They are working to restore the health of our natural world by empowering indigenous peoples, custodians of 80% of global biodiversity, to implement NDCs. Indeed, buy-in from all communities is vital to design and implement NDCs that work, including for women and young people. Working with communities across the globe, UNDP has witnessed transformations, large and small, with every action taking us forward towards our collective climate goals. Sustaining this momentum around NDCs and climate action requires partnerships and collaboration, and mutual respect. Long-standing partners of the climate promise, such as the European Union, Germany, Sweden, Spain, and Italy, have been joined by partners such as Japan, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Iceland, and Portugal. They are our financing partners in enabling us to work with our action partners, the program countries. In that sense, the climate promise also represents a major contribution to the NDC partnership that involves many of the countries I just referred to. We are also proud to work closely with implementing partners and members of the UN family, including the UNFCCC, UNEP, FAO, and the ILO, as well as IRENA. On behalf of UNDP, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all our partners, including UNDP's core financing partners, who enable us to make these kinds of investments for making this crucial work possible. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in many ways, our community stands on a precipice. We need leadership, political will, and investment to stop climate change in its tracks. Through the climate promise, developing countries are showing that change is not only possible when this leadership, this political will, and investment comes together, success stories become part of our narrative. It also shows what is achievable when the world approaches decarbonization as a driver of development, not as a constraint on development. COP27 must be a moment for countries to come together despite their differences, focus on shared interests, and take inspiration from the visionary leadership demonstrated in so many countries around the world, developed countries, developing countries, and set an example for those who are not leading by example. In doing so, our global community can take a massive step back from the precipice and be able to choose our common future as the direction in which we wish to travel together. Thank you.
And now we turn to one of our very close partners, UNFCCC, Deputy Executive Secretary Ovais Sarmad. Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Great to see you. Good morning, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you very much, Cassie. It was great to see you and distinguished panelists who are at the podium here. A great pleasure that you to participate at this event together with all of you, excellencies, distinguished delegates. This is an extremely important topic for everybody who knows what it's all about when we talk about NDCs. And we are very grateful to UNDP and ILO for co-hosting this event together with UNFCCC. As with everything else, we believe in collaboration and work with our UN partners, especially with UNDP, as we heard from Achim, Steiner, and ILO, is extremely important. As many of you have said before, we are at a critical juncture in the fight against climate change, but just looking at it here now, while we are here in Sharm el-Sheikh at this COP27, we are a midpoint of the negotiations, and those negotiations are happening as we speak. And these events, these voices, are extremely important to complement, to give the ambition, the energy, the push to the negotiators to do the right thing. And because we have a very small window of opportunity at this COP, but generally speaking, in addressing climate change. You all came here today to engage and share ideas with each other. We heard perspective on the opportunities as also highlighted by Achim Steiner, it's not all gloom and doom. I think the revolution, the renewable revolution is already here and now, and we are seeing great strides, innovation and transformation that is happening, but we need to scale it up and speed it in order to remain within the 1.5 degree goal that we have all committed to. Our stakeholders see the operationalization of key aspects of the Paris Agreement happening as we speak. The just transition is extremely important. We need to emphasize that, and more importantly, you see the role of the linkages to the work program on mitigation, adaptation, finance, and so on. So I thank you all for the constructive discussion. Together with the Egyptian presidency, the Secretariat will publish an informal note highlighting the key and emerging messages that have come out of this event. That will be posted on our website and be available to all stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, today is the first annual high-level event that we are engaged in on pre-2030 ambition, and has given us a clear political guidance for urgent climate ambition and action. And we strongly believe that this sets the way, the clear direction for all of us going forward. An ambitious result on the operationalization of the work program is needed to urgently scale up mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade. By end of 2030, we really must move to the new era we already have, but we need to scale that up. We very much look forward to continuing these discussions and conversations with all of you in the coming days and beyond, and hope that you will remain committed, not just at this COP, but especially when you go back to your professions and private lives, including discussions at the dinner table. We need to continue to raise the ambition and the importance of addressing the threat of climate change. Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you. All well?
Thank you very much, Ovais. And I think one thing that I think that has become clear over these last weeks and months is that when you work on climate change, there tends to be a lot of bad news. We've seen that the last 7 years are some of the hottest in history. We have headlines like those coming out of Pakistan, out of the Caribbean, out of the Horn of Africa. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed, and it's easy to feel a bit hopeless. And yet, I think there are reasons to be an optimist. And those reasons are what we want to talk about today. And I am so inspired by all of the people that are on our panel today, the speakers that we are going to hear, because it is through their work that we see these signals of progress. It's through their work that we start to see the glimmers on the horizon of getting ourselves out of this mess. And I think this is where we can start to have conversations about what is working on the ground. And we know we need to be bigger, we know we need to be faster, we know that we need to be at scale as quickly as possible. But it all starts here. It starts with good ideas. It starts with being able to have political will, civil society engagement, financial, technical support. It starts with these types of moves to be able to then eventually get at scale and to start bending the emissions curve and helping countries to have the resources and the support they need to be resilient to the impacts that are on their front door. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit also about the climate promise. And I'm very fortunate because with the climate promise, we support over 120 countries on their NDCs. And you can see here some of the countries behind me. And there's a very interesting trend that's going on, and you heard this in the administrator's remarks, is that we're seeing countries make a very big leap from the first generation NDCs to the second generation NDCs. That with the climate promise and with all of our partners, including our very close partner with the NDC partnership, as well as our supporters, that we have seen mitigation ambition go up, and we have seen adaptation ambition go up. This is remarkable because what it means is the Paris Agreement is working. Because the idea of the Paris Agreement was to have a ratchet mechanism, and every 5 years we get more ambitious and more ambitious. We need to be faster, we need to be bigger, but it is working. And that is a credit to a lot of the people on the panel today. And so we are going to have two big pieces to our event today. The first is a panel discussion across 3 big themes within NDCs. And we're going to talk about nature, land, and forests. We're going to talk about adaptation, and we're going to talk about a just transition. And we're so very honored to have on this panel the British Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Thérèse Coffey, Mr. Pham Van Tan, Deputy Director General of the Climate Department of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment from Vietnam, Ms. Diane Black-Lane, the Ambassador for Climate Change and Director of the Department of Environment from Antigua Barbuda, Mr. Juan Hofmeister, the Multilateral Governance Manager from the Green Climate Fund, Mr. Boubacar Fall, Adaptation Expert and Vice President of the National Committee of Climate Change in Senegal, and of course, Ms. Elizabeth Gulugulu, the global focal point for the official children and youth constituency of the UNFCCC. And then we're going to go into a forward-looking piece of this event. And we're going to hear from Jochen Flasbarth, the State Secretary for the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. We're going to hear from His Excellency Senator Honorable Matthew Samuda, the Minister in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. And we're going to hear from Archana Soreng, Indigenous climate activist, researcher, and representative of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. We have a packed agenda, and every single one of these people gives us inspiration for how we can tackle this crisis. And before we get started, I promised you some surprises. And the first is going to be a video from Dear World Leaders. This video comes to us from Mexico. For some of you that may be familiar with Dear World Leaders, there's a whole installation you can see over toward the plenaries. And we asked people to film themselves with messages to world leaders that we could then transmit during COP and beyond COP. And some of these videos are quite remarkable, and we're really happy to share them with you today. So let's start the first one.
Queridos líderes del mundo, van en nuestros hombros todas las causas de este desmoronamiento de todos los mecanismos y sistemas de la modernidad. Ignoramos lo esencial, lo vital, los servicios de la naturaleza. Se nos olvidaron, cerramos los ojos y la mercantilizamos. Y hoy día queremos hablar de soluciones basadas en la naturaleza sin tomar en cuenta quiénes son los dueños de los bosques. Necesitamos recursos financieros con protocolos amigables a las comunidades locales que permitan capitalizar a sus poseedores con un manejo que propicie la regeneración. Necesitamos protocolos locales.
Our first topic is going to be on forests, land, and nature. And quite simply, there's no solution to the climate crisis without forests and land. This sector provides up to a third of the emissions reductions needed to meet the global goals on climate change. And as we heard from this video from Mexico, that there is no solution without the engagement of indigenous and local communities. And the scale of the challenge is vast, but it is possible. And we're going to hear from 2 speakers today from the United Kingdom and from Vietnam. And the first question goes all the way to the end there at Secretary of State Thérèse Coffey. What is driving the UK's commitment to supporting countries on NDC ambition and implementation in the forest nature area in particular? I know that this has been a priority for COP26 and certainly on the road to COP27, a very, very powerful moves have been made by the UK. Secretary, over to you.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting the UK to speak today. I'm really pleased to be here with my friend from Vietnam, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the work that is underway. I know that we're already working together to make sure you're able to take forest carbon into account as part of your recently enhanced NDC, to make the most of emerging carbon markets, and thirdly, to collect the data you need to manage your amazing mangroves, the blue forests as I call them, for the future as well. So, in answer to the first question, why the UK is working with nature-rich countries around the world on their NDCs is quite simple. Oh, it's getting closer. Sorry. I was being nice about Vietnam, especially mangroves, in case you missed it. So, in answer to the first question on why the UK is working with nature-rich countries around the world on their NDCs, I mean, frankly, it's quite simple. As our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said at the start of the conference, there is no solution to climate change that does not involve protecting and restoring nature. And the evidence for why this is so urgent is now all around us and plain to see on every continent. Although, of course, it has been clear in both the science and the wisdom of Indigenous people and local communities for many years already. So for all of us, protecting and restoring the natural world, whether that's on land and indeed our oceans, that needs to be part of our plans to tackle both the causes and the impacts of climate change in our own countries. And we do need to work together to protect and restore the vast natural wonders on which the whole world relies, including the green lungs of the planet. Thinking about the other questions that we want to get through today, it means the most important things we can do fall under these broad priorities as well. So today, I am delighted to announce that the United Kingdom will be investing up to £6 million into the UN's Climate Promise Programme over the course of this year and the next 2 financial years. Now that builds on the... Thank you. That builds on the £3 million contribution we provided last year to support developing countries, including Vietnam, set out how nature can help them to meet their climate commitments, to use that knowledge to make those commitments the most ambitious that they can be, and then critically to implement them as well. Now we know this is not always straightforward, because we are in the middle of figuring this out in the UK as well. Whether that's working on how we can take account of the blue carbon stored in seagrass and salt marsh habitats around our shores, or making sure the perennial challenge that we get the right trees in the right places in landscapes across our country. But it is vital that we all get to grips with this as quickly as possible. And of course, we need to help countries to get on with implementing nature-based solutions as well. That is why, having committed to doubling UK international climate finance to £11.6 billion, our Prime Minister announced earlier this week that we are tripling our funding on adaptation to £1.5 billion by 2025. And we are committed to spending at least £3 billion of that on nature and nature-based solutions, and to spending half of that on forests, including our disappearing blue forests. As well as working with communities in some of the most important but fragile ecosystems through our newly established £100 million Biodiverse Landscapes Fund and our £500 million Blue Planet Fund. I'm pleased that the UK is investing £40 million of climate finance to establish a global centre and biodiversity and climate to draw together expertise from across the UK and around the world in order to help us scale up quickly. Now, we know that nature-based solutions are effective. They turn each investment into solutions to multiple challenges, and that is exactly what we need now, alongside deep cuts to emissions across sectors. So our aim is to boost the efforts of developing countries to value, protect and restore nature, and to use natural resources more sustainably. So we take on the causes and the impacts of climate change and the decline of nature, as well as supporting more of the world's poorest and most vulnerable people who are implementing solutions on the front line. And of course, the United Kingdom needs to continue to pursue the priorities that have guided our presidency of COP26, identifying every lever we have to get finance flowing in the right direction and accelerating the systemic changes we need at scale on everything from food to finance, as well as making sure promises made in Glasgow are honoured and implemented across the board, including through the new Forest and Climate Leaders Partnership of major forest basins and global economic centres, all committed to keeping this at the top of the political agenda year after year. Friends, time is not on our side, but it's the right thing to do, and it is the smart thing to do, to make sure that taking nature into account helps us be more ambitious and to work together to implement those plans as widely and as quickly as possible, particularly in the places that are most affected and that underpin our shared future. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary of State. We are thrilled at this increased contribution to the climate promise. Congratulations on the work with the Forest Climate Leaders Partnership and how 90% of NDCs talk about forests and land, and this is such an important opportunity to start to scale this up. Thank you so much for being with us today. And now we turn to Mr. Pham Van Tan in Vietnam. Vietnam has increased NDC ambition and is driving forward now on implementation. Could you tell us some of the key factors driving this momentum in Vietnam and some of the challenges that you have faced, particularly when it comes to land use and forests?
Thank you. Thank you very much for introduction and giving me this opportunity to speak. And thank you, Her Excellencies, that you mentioned Vietnam in your intervention. As you know that at COP26 last year, Vietnam announced that it would take stronger measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to achieve net zero emission by 2050. We also joined other initiatives, including Global Call for Clean Power Transition, Global Methane Pledge, and Glasgow Leaders for Declaration for Forest and Land Use. And then I believe that you contribute very good for that declaration. The important question is now how to turn commitments into reality, how to turn words into actions. Vietnam strongly believes that climate change is affecting to all. Therefore, we must all enjoy hand in delivering the climate action. In this process, the government must take the first steps and play the leading role. Right after COP26, a national committee for implementation of commitment at COP26 established with the Prime Minister as the chairman. Ministers and leaders of ministries are the members. The steering committee have met 3 times this year and reached many important decisions, including passage of the national strategies on climate change for the period until 2050, the National Action Plan for Reduction of Methane until 2030, and many others. On the 8th of November, the second updated NDC of Vietnam, or we call NDC 2022, was approved by the government and submitted to the UNFCCC. The 2022 NDC reflected concrete action to be taken for periods up to 2030, which align with the net zero pathway and methane pledge. You can see Vietnam significantly increased efforts in our NDC 2022 in comparison with the updated NDC submitted in 2020. For your information, implementation of NDC is now the must and as the requirement of Vietnamese law to achieve 2030 mitigation and adaptation targets in our NDC. Forest, land, and natural solutions play the important role and most effective way. To reach this stage, we have to prepare for many years, starting with awareness raising, conducting studies, and step-by-step taking action. I'm happy to say that many of development partners, including UNDP, are helping us in this important process. Thank you for that. Today, it is widely recognized in Vietnam that low emission development and climate resilience is the must and only way to develop the country. We are guided by very strong commitment and leadership from the government and enjoy the preparation of private sector and support by international community. However, Vietnam has long and challenging way ahead to reach net zero. And how to maintain the momentum of own ministry, organization, and individuals. How our own negative impacts of the transition are addressed, especially the impact of poor and disadvantaged persons. And we can find sufficient resources to pay for additional costs. Initial estimates show that to get net zero emission by 2050, we need additional 370 billion US dollar based on 2020 price with 10% discount. The cost is very huge to Vietnam. Finally, I wish to say that success can only be achieved by collective efforts. Vietnam is taking the first step. How far we can go depends very much on the effort of other countries and the support we receive. Our effort would be only meaningful if other countries take similar action. Vietnam needs your help and happy to cooperate with all in this important journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pham Van Ten. This idea of how we can build momentum and how we can really turn this commitment into reality is so important for forest, land, and nature, and also about the next topic that we are going to have. The next topic is adaptation. We don't have to look far from the headlines to know that adaptation is a part of the climate action picture. And you can see here from the slides that 122 million people could fall into poverty by 2030 due to climate change. And one of the biggest barriers to taking action on climate change is finance. Ensuring that countries have the public, private, international, and national resources to be able to meet this challenge. And so that these stories that we see now of countries being overwhelmed by the climate crisis can be a thing of the past, that we can be more resilient to these impacts. Now, UNDP has been very fortunate to be helping on the front lines when it comes to adaptation. Through our portfolio in over 95 countries and $1.6 billion in partnership with the vertical funds and bilateral partners, we are doing everything we can to support countries to be able to tackle this. And we can really testify that the potential impact of ambitious adaptation measures can really make a difference for countries and communities around the world. And we're going to talk to two people today who are at the forefront of these efforts. So, with our adaptation panel, we are going to start with you, Boubacar. Senegal's NDC prioritizes adaptation, which is underscored in the in-depth adaptation planning process that has been conducted. And I'm wondering, what role does adaptation play in Senegal's endeavor to achieve its 2035 vision of an emerging Senegal? Can you share a little bit about this for us? Over to you, Boubacar.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So, thank you and for inviting me to this panel. First, I'm going to apologize, but because I'm from a French country speaking, but I will try to say some words in English. So you're right, we achieve our NDCs, and the document arises two aspects. I mean, mitigation and adaptation. So the particularity of Senegal, we have more than 700 kilometers of coastal zone. And most of people are concentrated in this area. I mean, around 98% of our industrial are located in this area. And our coastal zone is particularly vulnerable on climate, coastal erosion. So in our NDCs, it arises about 8 sectors, the most vulnerable on climate change impact. I mean agriculture, livestock, coastal zone, health, biodiversity, floods, fisheries, and water resources. I mean, the main sector we should lead our national plan, the Senegal Emergent Plan, PSE, are particularly vulnerable on climate change. If nothing is done, I mean, the objective we want to achieve on 2035 can be lost. So that's why adaptation is a priority of our national government. We try to adopt a sectoral approach. But right now, for implementation, there is not a global strategy for implementation. We can identify a sectoral implementation from the support of some partners, I mean USAID for fisheries sector and agriculture for FAO. But our NDC cannot get right now. The most constraint is the availability of financial resources for implementation. So that's why we are waiting the support of some partner to implement, because there is everywhere emergency to implementation. But from the government, there is not yet resources for a global implementation of our NDC. So we try to go step by step, waiting some support from partners to implement. The others challenge were the scale of the implementation, which actor can be involved in the implementation and which resources. Because, I mean, the NDCs is assessed in national level, but I think that the implementation will be more efficient in local area from local communities. So I think, yes, I think that I can say, sorry for my bad English. I'm more fluent in French. Thank you so much.
Your English is fantastic, and we appreciate your generosity in speaking English with us just now, and the story that you tell about going step by step, about looking at things like coastal zones and biodiversity and ensuring that local voices are within this process are so very important. Thank you for sharing that with us. We now turn to Juan Hofmeister, Multilateral Governance Manager with the Green Climate Fund. Juan, thank you so much for joining us today. And given your sort of perspectives with the Green Climate Fund, how are you seeing things that may be accelerating investment and adaptation or maybe hindering, and what do you think our priorities should be? Juan, over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm quite glad to address this issue because I believe that when we speak of some of the challenges, they are much in line with what our colleague has just said. But let's first take stock of the positive. I think that, as was said at the introduction of this session, we have seen marked progress in how we're beginning to understand adaptation efforts and how we're beginning to understand adaptation needs. And this is very important. It's something that needs to be recognized. The quantum leap that we have seen in these revised NDCs is something that begins to now give us a clear sense of what are the priorities. We begin to see a focus on freshwater resources, food production, terrestrial and wetland ecosystem, some strategic economic sectors, human health, disaster risk reduction, etc. So I think it's very important that we have now a much solid understanding of this. And at the same time, this also means we now have a much more solid understanding of the gap in resources available for adaptation. Last year, we heard about the call for doubling of adaptation finance. We know that we're still quite far from that, and I'm not speaking just of the GCF alone, but the planet as a whole. So in that sense, that's a little bit the context in which we need to understand this question. Specifically to hinder what's hindering investment, very much in line with what the colleague from Senegal just said, we know that addressing adaptation does not respond to a one-size-fits-all model. We need to have adaptation interventions that are tailored to specific needs, that recognize specific vulnerabilities, and this has been a little bit of a challenge. We have had countries that have their needs very well articulated, but when it's time to move forward and begin translating these interventions, whether into fundable or bankable interventions, we begin to see some challenges around capacities to do this type of management of the information, structuring of proposals, etc. So this is something that has definitely been hindering, going from the understanding of needs towards adaptation implementation. This is something that we recognize and that we have been trying to address. In the context of GCF, for example, we did have important challenges that we recognize around trying to get past the questions around the climate science and how that climate science needed to be represented and downscale at each of the funding proposals. We have tried this year to make some progress around this, or wanting to build around more clear principles for climate impact, rather than sort of wanting to have this rather strict approach to a downscaling of climate science. But nevertheless, especially when we're talking about systemic interventions, there are still some challenges there in beginning to sort of put these interventions that are at the project level in that broader context. I think we also need to recognize that structuring an adaptation project is not the same as structuring a mitigation project. And this is something that we have been coming at for some time, and that we're just beginning to sort of see the type of proof of concept adaptation projects that demonstrate some of these barriers, like, for example, private sector involvement, that conceptually used to be something that many people will challenge in the adaptation context. We're beginning to see some progress in that direction as well. So let me conclude perhaps just briefly touching from the GCF perspective, what are some of our priorities? Obviously, adaptation remains an utmost priority for GCF. We have, this is in our DNA. It's part of our governing instrument that mandates us to ensure a 50-50 balance between our funding for mitigation and adaptation. It is a constant dance as the projects sort of get approved, others move forward. We're at the moment actually at 51-49%, so we still need to do a little bit of work. But this is going to be a constant dynamic and something we have to work. Another priority for us will continue to be the focus on the most vulnerable. That is explicitly LDC sits in Africa as we deliver on this half of adaptation financing that is expected from our portfolio. At this moment, we have had over 209 projects. We're looking to benefit about 253 million people. Of this, at the moment, about 57 million people are already being benefited from the projects that have been approved. There's, of course, some time to want to see this touch the ground. Now, in terms of our priorities, and specifically in the context of adaptation, obviously a priority is precisely to address those challenges that I spoke to before. And so in this sense, we see, particularly as we go into a new programming cycle for GCF2, we see as a urgent need to unlock further financing for adaptation, building the capacity to have those climate assessments that are a priority, and for this to make readiness resources and project preparation facility resources available. The need to undertake the right type of feasibility studies, again at a systemic level, that speak of sort of how one intervention is responding to that need at the NDC level, and identified much better the potential solutions and the way in which structure innovative solutions to address the needs that are already well identified and justified in the NDCs. Lastly, as you know, the Green Climate Fund has had in its initial days the launch of what was the support for the formulation of national adaptation plans or other adaptation planning processes, $3 million for each eligible country. We continue to now hear from developing country board members in particular, and also here in the context of the negotiations, the need to rethink and to recapitalize how we're thinking about making further resources available to this purpose. And this is something that we hope through a much more targeted formulation of these resources for NAP planning, that we can conduct the type of vulnerabilities assessment and identify and prioritize the type of interventions that match with those adaptation needs. This is something, of course, we hope to see in our next replenishment cycle. And lastly, we have, in terms of trying to address the barriers, the GCF has published a set of sector guides, including on some of the cross-cutting adaptation areas such as health, food, water, livelihoods, infrastructure, and the built environment and ecosystems. These sector guides set to provide an overview of the type of greatest impact that can be structured to drive paradigm shift in these sectors. And there are a little bit of how-to tools to help countries or accredited entities and other partners develop the high quality and impact funding proposals. So again, the combination of all these tools we hope will address some of these barriers, and this will be, of course, a process, but one where I think we're beginning to see great momentum in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. And I think that this builds so much on what we've heard today about climate action has to resonate at the local level, and it has to be context specific. And thinking about, particularly in adaptation, this idea that, you know, what you said, mitigation is not the same as adaptation, and being very responsive to that is something that is quite critical. Now we're going to move on to our third topic, which is just transition. We hear so much about this phrase, and quite frankly, we have a lot of work to do to really unpack this. And we know, for example, that a third of NDCs and more than half of long-term strategies reference a just transition, yet only a fraction of these have dedicated sections with concrete measures in them. So what this tells us is that we have pathways there. We have sort of the general direction, but the specific steps and the specific ways that we can achieve a just transition is the direction that we need to go in. We have some work to do in this area. And because of that, we also have an opportunity to learn. We have an opportunity to learn from countries that are embarking on this journey, that are embedding a just transition within their NDCs and long-term strategies, and countries that are able to really help be pioneers for us all to be able to manage this just at the scale and speed that we know needs to happen. And so we are going to start with Antigua Barbuda. Ambassador Diane Black-Lane, thank you so very much for joining us today. And Antigua Barbuda's enhanced NDC acknowledges the socioeconomic disruption that an energy transition might bring. And it lays out specific actions that could be taken to support a just transition across the workforce and a whole of economy, from operationalizing a funding mechanism, supporting vulnerable communities. There's a lot that is underway. Could you share a little bit more about this?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm replacing my ambassador from New York, so I'll bring the national perspective. So I've been a climate and finance negotiator for some time, although I did marine biology, so I love forests and mangroves. But when I was working on forests and mangroves, we realized that the financial sector does not value nature. And right now, if you go to, and I said this like 10 years ago when I started negotiating, if both of us, if we were to go into Bank of America in the United States and ask for $100 million to destroy forest, $100 million to protect the forest, who would win? Anybody can guess? Who would win? Who would get that loan first? Would it be A, to clear the forest and have livestock, or B, to keep the forest intact? Who will get the loan better? A or B? A? Anybody else? Anybody think B will win that race? The same forest, the same area. Right. So right now, the financial sector is not geared or structured to protect the environment in any way, the private. And so this is why we come to these COPs and we have the Green Climate Fund. We have specialized funding vehicles, we call them, just to protect the environment. But the entire financial system of the world depends on the natural ecosystem. But for some reason, it's structured so that it's easier to destroy it. And that happened in all of the sectors that we work in. In the area of climate change, it is a little bit unique in the sense that what we did was to take our energy sector and entrust the entire sector into one type of energy, which is the fossil fuel industry. And then we linked and hooked every aspect of our financial system wagon to that industry and create a powerful combination that managed to lift many, many, many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But it did not go all the way. So 50% of the world population cannot afford this energy system. And then many governments rightly say, many politicians and many of us who are activists, this is not working. Let us make a change. And guess what happens? They lose the next election. So basically, we created a powerful partnership between the fossil fuel industry and the finance sector to create a savior to help lift so many people out of poverty. And at some point, we all do something, and that will help us to get to the next level. And then you reach at that level, and you realize, okay, I don't need, that thing needs to shift. And that is when the savior for all of us turned into a monster. No politician here at this COP can address that monster. You just cannot. If you go after the fossil fuel industry and the financial sector, they will make sure they lobby to, and you will be out of power. There's no question about it. There's no politician that can go up against them. So in my little island of Antigua and Barbuda, because we're smaller, we really have done something which I know a lot of countries are not in a position to do or haven't been able to do. But even though we delegate, we have a democracy, and we delegate significant amount of power to politicians and our ministers and our prime ministers who we respect, we decided to keep some of the powers to ourselves. So right now in Antigua and Barbuda, you cannot. That's illegal. And for us to move away from this monster that we create, we have to move towards a sector or a system where the energy system is diversified and you give consumer choice. Right now, many of us here in many developing countries do not have a choice. You either have a choice of buying electricity from the grid or cutting down a tree and burning coal and making your own energy system. This is what a lot of people are faced with across the world. That has to change. That has to change. And for many of you, and this is not the first time we're faced with this type of rapid transformation that we require. So we're here and we're thinking as the introduction is negative. It is not. We have done this before, and we have done this before many times in many countries by the one and only thing that can make change, and that is people empowerment. You have to empower people to make this change. So I remember when we had, anybody had when you were growing up the landline phones? Yeah, everybody remembered. Some people really don't remember them, bless their sweet soul. And they don't remember that, but I remember that. And if you're English, you remember Cable and Wireless in our Caribbean had a monopoly on the provision of communication. Everybody remember that. And when we tried to break it, they threatened to sue us. They said they won't fund cricket. If anybody know Caribbean people, we love cricket. Some of the best cricketers in the world came from there. Those are our major heroes. And we were terrified that they won't sponsor cricket. And guess what? They went ahead and broke the monopoly. Since they've broke the monopoly in the communication sector, the amount of jobs created in that sector, like 400%. None of the gloom and doom that was predicted and by the communication companies at the time came through. None of it came through. The sky just simply did not fall in. And you know what? We're going to transition here again, and the sky will not fall in. And we will be here at a COP in the near future where many of us, including one in South Korea, will be able to say, I drive an electric car, I get my electricity not from the grid anymore, I made a choice. And the thing is that we now need to move this choice into people and let them be smart enough to make the choice that they want. Our NDC in Antigua and Barbuda is about that. First of all, is to give consumer choice, especially women. Now, in Antigua, we normally say, no offense to men, that men can live in a chicken coop with nothing there. They're happy to live in filth. They're happy to live in minimalistic life. But women, no. For us to go into the workspace, we need energy. We need to wash our clothes. We need energy-saving devices to allow us to go to work. So I'm here at COP, and I have 2 boys, my husband and a daughter. I know whenever I'm coming on the plane, I call them and say, I'm 2 hours away, because that is when they're going to start to clean the house for when I get home. So they can live in filth for the entire 20 days that I'm here, and they know when I get home, I wanted the place to be clean. I will not be able to settle down until it's clean. And that is what women want. We want to be able to turn on the power, and it's not overly expensive. We're not burning down the whole planet to get it done. And we have a right as women, we are consumers, to get exactly that. And it's not unreasonable to ask. So we're saying, Antigua women are saying, this is what we want from our NDC. This is what we want from the Just Transition when we apply for money from the Green Climate Fund. Our last set of money we got from the Green Climate Fund went to these households so they can purchase their own renewable energy system, even though it's illegal. And they did it. The sky did not fall in. So finally, the one area of just transition that we wanted to talk about, 2 areas, is that when you have marijuana becoming legal, in many countries of the world, there's so many persons who are locked up and arrested because of marijuana. Now it's becoming legalized. They're not getting any opportunity to create businesses from it. Isn't that unfair? And so it was legalized. It was great. But then the same, they're not being able to set up the businesses and benefited from this transition, like set up their own companies, not just getting a job, setting up their own companies. We have to be careful that in those countries that are progressive enough and they will transition, it will create a lot of jobs. And we have to make sure that we are ready and our workforce is ready to take advantage of those jobs. And we are ready to take advantage of the small businesses that will be created by having distributive energy, for example. One is right, adaptation can include the private sector with properly set policies and so on. We're looking at, when we talk private sector, many of us think of the big business that you can invest in and buy their stocks and buy their bonds. Most of the businesses in this world, those are not the type of business. They're small business. They're a farmer. They are a person who have a preschool. They have somebody that run a church. I mean, really tiny businesses in all over the world, even large countries. They need to transition. They need to know what is coming, just like any business. You need business intelligence. So when you speak to them, it's not gloom and doom. What is the business intelligence? How can we get ready? And where can we get financing to transition? So my final thing is, the sectors that need to transition are the energy sector, the financial sector, and these are sectors that are predominated by men. Men are not easy to change, at least the women will say they're not very easy to change. And if they can't change and they don't understand the transition, they will not come along with the transition. And we've seen that in the coal industry all over the world, where men find it very difficult to transition. And we're seeing that in the African countries with the coal industry. There are ways that men can transition, but men don't learn the same way as women. And in many of our educational systems, we're teaching boys the same way that we're expecting girls to learn. So we need to think about it a little bit more carefully, structure your adaptation projects a little bit better, even your mitigation project. And I will say to one from the Green Climate Fund and everywhere else, the ESS on gender, we focus on women and girls. But we have the sector we need to transition. Most of the workers are men. So we need to start talking about that in a way that is non-threatening. Men don't want to be thought of as vulnerable people. Fine. But we are smart enough to live here on this planet. I have great confidence in our intellect as human beings, and we need to start talking about how do we have the just transition of everyone, in particular men. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Powerful words, as always. And now we turn to Elizabeth. Thank you so much for being with us here today. You have been very involved in Zimbabwe's NDC. You have been really at the heart of this enhancement process. And can you share a little bit more about how youth have been leading the way in Zimbabwe on the NDC?
Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak. I come from a country that the total population of the country is 18 million. 67% of my country are young people, and 92% of my country are in the informal sector. And our country, we have demonstrated what a whole government and a whole society approach is, not only in the enhancement process of the NDCs, but also in the implementation phase of the NDCs. I'm sure you're aware that last year we submitted our youth policy brief, which was presented in our cabinet, but that youth policy brief had specifics on how young people are going to occupy the space and make sure that they unlock jobs in different sectors that are according to the IPCC sector. So you find that right now we have realized that yes, there are gaps that are there in a just transition. The gaps that are there could include information on how the environment is going to recover in the just transition, and also, the lack of information on data in terms of how many jobs are young people going to get. But in my country, I'm glad to tell you that and let you know that we were quite prepared. And up to now, we have approximately 18 young people that have trained as greenhouse gas, under the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, focusing on the waste sector, the energy sector, the industrial processes, and product use and the agriculture, forest, and other land uses. We have also established different waste centers this year, total up to 5, but our target is 55 with funds permitting, so as to make sure that we unlock jobs. And we are not only focusing on unlocking jobs, but I'm talking about unlocking green jobs for young people. So these are some of the achievements that we have done in my country. Of course, there is need for capacity, more capacity. There is need for more empowerment, just like what she was saying. The communities need to be empowered. Even young people, they need to be empowered. And if we are talking about capacity, we are not only looking at financial capacity, but we are also looking at technical capacity. How best can we build the skills of young people so that they are able to, unlock these jobs that we are talking about. They'll be able to manufacture the solar panels rather than importing. They'll be able to manufacture the lithium batteries rather than exporting lithium and importing lithium batteries themselves. So this is what we have been doing, and this is what we have been working on in my country.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you for all of the work that you have done to be at the center of this and to drive ambition here. Now we're going to look a little bit forward, and I would like to invite Secretary Flasbarth to join us at the podium. Germany has been a key partner to us throughout this journey, and you in particular, as the champion you are, as the celebrity you are on climate action in this process, we would appreciate hearing your reflections.
Thank you very much. No, I'm not Thérèse Coffey, but I like her. So I will be very brief as I have to jump to the next meeting to make all our pledges. It's a lovely day today, and as you said before, many said before, we are behind. We are not on track for 1.5, so we have to do more. I already attended a meeting of the NDC partnership today, and that links very much to what I have to say here. To ensure that our partners can catch up, that we go into the direction what you just discussed of just transition, not only to decarbonize our economies, but also to do it in a just way that is digestible for societies and even overcomes inequalities. We want to specifically support our support, increase our support for the UNDP's climate promise. We are already in that, and I'm here to announce that we will support the UNDP climate promise with another 26 million euros. Thank you for that. This is coming from our development portfolio from the Ministry for Development and Cooperation, but also from our Ministry for Economy, Energy and Climate through the International Climate Initiative. Thanks for being brief, but I think the essential things have been said.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Secretary. We feel like we've been sort of family with Germany since this work on NDCs began. Hard to believe it was even before the Paris Agreement, and starting with those regional dialogues and looking at how we can get that first generation of NDCs, now the second, now on to the third. So thank you so much for all of that support and the collaboration, the close collaboration. Thank you. Thank you. And now he goes. Off to make a result here at COP. We're going to go back now to our Dear World Leaders videos. We have 2 more messages from Bhutan and North Macedonia, these powerful videos, these powerful messages to all of us. So let's play those.
Dear world leaders, for the past 6 days, I've been trekking in the Bhutanese Himalayas to get to a glacier. This is Tortomi Glacier. Each passing day, it's getting bigger and bigger due to global warming. Now, there are thousands of such lakes on the verge of bursting, threatening millions of lives and livelihoods across the Himalayas. This is our message to you. Stop deforestation, immediate transition to renewable energy, inclusion of climate studies in school curriculum. My name is Jamyang, and I am the messenger.
And now I turn to His Excellency, the Honorable Senator Matthew Samuda from Jamaica. Please, you are welcome to the podium here, and we invite your reflections, certainly in your role as a leader on climate, but also as Jamaica's co-chairmanship of the NDC partnership. Excellency, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And a pleasure to join you here along such an esteemed panel. Is the volume, am I being heard? It's on, okay. Thank you all so much. It's indeed my privilege to join you here this afternoon, especially amongst such an esteemed panel. Jamaica has not sat idly by since COP26. We have in fact been very busy in furthering our climate change agenda. One way in which we have furthered that agenda has been our role as NDC co-chair, which comes to an end virtually now. It was a privilege to co-chair the work of the NDC partnership. And during that time, we would have overseen the partnership's 2021-25 work plan. We would have overseen the launch of the Partnership Action Fund, the launch of the finance strategy, which would have been done in Jamaica earlier this year, and the launch of the readiness support for greening of central banks. And just last week, the launch of a new thematic call on long-term low-emission development strategies. The partnership has grown to some 207 members, with 120 nations, 100 of which being developing nations. We have in excess of 85 institutional partners and civil society members. Now, this partnership is particularly important to a small island developing state such as Jamaica, not just because we were co-chair, but because of what it provides. It provides a mechanism, it provides a route for us to access the technical support that we desperately need to put us in a position to access finance. It is why we're particularly proud of the role as co-chair and why we believe in the message of partnership, why we believe that through togetherness, all things are possible. There is no doubt that the financing gaps are widening. There is no doubt that as these gaps widen, our chance is not just at survival, but our prospects for prosperity and shared economic development are indeed dwindling. So we are in a race against time. It's why we absolutely endorse the multilateral process. It's why we continue to work through partnership mechanisms such as the NDC. But as I said, Jamaica has not sat idly by. During this period, Jamaica would have launched what is called the Jamaica Systemic Risk Assessment Tool, which is the first of its kind. It would have been developed by support from the GCF and the CCRI and indeed the government of UK, but would have been designed by the University of Oxford. This is a roadmap for investment. This tells us and has assessed the infrastructure risk that we face because of climate change in Jamaica. It has created an investment pathway for us to ensure that every dollar of our limited capital spend is indeed made in a manner that brings about either an ROI or sustainable infrastructure that both protects our people and creates a path to economic growth. Now, that in and of itself allows us to have the discussions that we will have upon the completion of our national adaptation plan. It is us putting in place the systems that say to major donor partners, we are indeed ready and our projects are well thought out and they are indeed bankable. And we encourage you to come and work with us. Because there is the obvious moral need for calling out international development partners to increase the rate of finance. There is the obvious social need. But we are ensuring as a small island developing state that we have ticked the boxes and we have done what is absolutely necessary. It is why we believe we stand on firm ground when we say it is absolutely important that we meet the targets that were set out for us to achieve the Paris Climate Change Agreement. It is why we cannot allow 1.5 to become 1.7 or 2 degrees. With each 0.1 of temperature rise, the world becomes a little more miserable. We all are at more risk. So this afternoon, I'm thankful for UNDP for convening this forum because it is important that there is an exchange of ideas. It is important there is an exchange of views. And it is important that for us as small island developing states, that we demand that financing be made available. We demand that there become harmonization in the process for application of funds across IDPs. It is why we say the bar must be lowered for us to access the adaptation funds which are available, and why it is absolutely important that those funds are actually in line with the needs of the globe now. I know you have a short period of time. I thank you for giving me the floor. It has indeed been my pleasure to represent Jamaica's views, and indeed the NDC partnership's views.
Excellency, we are so grateful for your time today and helping us to hear more about Jamaica's leadership globally and also the steps that are being taken nationally. And we are also so grateful for the leadership of Una Mae Gordon, who has been with us also from the early days, and your leadership has been invaluable to us. Thank you. And now we are going to turn to Archana Soreng, who is going to talk to us a little bit about how we can ensure the fair inclusion of Indigenous youth and minority representatives, not only in the design, but also in the implementation of NDCs. Archana, over to you.
Johar everyone, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, and my dear friends and young people, those who have not been able to join us today at COP27 due to multiple reasons. I want to say to all the young people, I'm so proud of you all for fighting so hard and advocating for climate action. And today, as I stand here sharing my thoughts on advancing NDCs of countries, the first and the foremost thing which is really critical for us to ensure that is incorporated in the NDCs is young people, indigenous people, local communities, Afro-descendant communities needs to be center of NDC policy-making processes and needs to be center of the decision-making spaces. We need safe and enabling spaces for young people, indigenous people, and local communities to be engaging in the NDCs and thereby ensuring meaningful leadership of them. We spoke about forest, nature, and land. We spoke about adaptation and just transition. It's really critical to have rights of indigenous people over the land, forest, and territories supporting and promoting the traditional knowledge and practices incorporated in the NDCs by the countries. The countries, those who have already incorporated it, it's critical to have it implemented on ground. And in these processes, we need free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous people, local communities, and young people. We need to have participatory consultations across the regions, across the levels, and ensuring that there is language justice, because there's a need to have contextualized learning and sharing in order to have an informed NDCs which is understood and which is participatory of communities, those who are most affected by impacts of climate crisis and who are front lines of climate action. When we talk about adaptation, it is really critical that we have climate finance prioritizing adaptation. We indigenous people have been adapting to climate crisis and have been resilient. But the question is, how long? And the question is, who decides for us these adaptation policies? It should be us deciding and participating in these adaptation policies, and thus it requires indigenous people, local communities, and young people to be integral part of climate adaptation processes. And when we talk about climate adaptation, I would like to emphasize the need of intersectionality between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Often we see that there are in watertight compartments, and that leads to various challenges on grounds because it's the same communities, it's the same people on ground which are being affected. So when we are drafting the climate adaptation policies, it's really critical that the departments in the national levels and countries are coming together to have an intersectional approach in the climate adaptation policies. Just transition has to keep climate justice and human rights-based approach at the center of its core. We cannot further marginalize young people, indigenous people, local communities, and Afro-descendant communities in a mere way where we are trying to have a just transition. And this needs to be concerned, and this is a concern where we need to be alert, we need to be aware, and we need to make sure that people are on the table of the decision-making spaces where we as indigenous community do not want to be further marginalized in terms of going towards just transition. And that's why I would like to say that we indigenous people, young people, Afro-descendants and local communities should be leaders of climate action and not victims of climate policies. I would like to end by saying that I welcome all the advancement in NDCs made by the countries. We all can work together and attain the Paris Agreement goals. It can be done with love, respect, and solidarity for each one of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Archana. And now we turn to our final Dear World Leaders video.
Dear world leaders, the climate crisis is happening and we need action fast. As a South Sudanese refugee, my country has been affected by extreme flooding for the past 3 years. This is all attributed to the growing consequences of climate change. Our homes submerged in water, our basic livelihood under threat. Let's take responsibility, make firm commitments, and stick to them in order to avert this global crisis.
This brings our event to a close. We couldn't have said it better than all of the Dear World Leaders videos, our fantastic panel. Thank you so very much. And a huge note of gratitude to the people that made this event happen. Jenny, Alana, Mehmet, Samira, Barbara, Racine, Kim, Rohini, Julie, Sanji, our partners at UNFCCC, our partners at ILO. Thank you so much for giving us signals of hope during this conference, during this time. We can meet this challenge. We can do it. We have to work together. Thank you so much.